some challenges with reporting from last time. So it was a good reminder for me to follow up again because we were trying to do a recovery on that file. So thanks for that. Thanks for that reminder. And thanks for coming to the meeting today. So the only item on the agenda today is to talk about a possible future potential street bond. So our intention here is that I'll give a small presentation. Rob Innerfeld was not sure if he was going to be able to join us right at the beginning, but the plan will be that I will give a small presentation, which is really consistent with what several of the other people in the meeting have seen earlier, and then we'll just have a discussion. We appreciate the feedback and knowledge of this group, and so I think we're looking forward to getting some of that feedback and having some of those great discussions. Does anybody have questions, comments, etc., around process today, not around the potential bond membership issue, but anybody have a question around process before we get rolling? Okay, let's go Alan first and then Rob.
Yeah, I'm curious if there will be a subsequent SRRP meeting to maybe make a more formal recommendation, or if there's just going to be discussion and you're just going to glean what our comments are and take it from there.
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are some other stakeholder groups that we've made the commitment to going back to again as a follow-up. So I think that we could do that here. Originally, when we had planned this first meeting to be in February, we actually have enough hold on our calendar for next week, but we can talk as we wrap up this meeting today if we still think that's appropriate. It might make sense to move that out a little bit so it's not, 2 days from now we're back in this room again. But certainly we're willing to come back and talk with the group again. We've done something similar with the Active Transportation Committee. We presented in February and then we'll go back again in March as a follow-up. And part of that is, as we're talking about this potential bond measure, it's getting feedback and then making adjustments, right? Both from internal and external stakeholders, kind of refining what that looks like as we move forward. So I think coming back is appropriate. Does that help?
Yeah, that answers the question, and particularly because there are people out in the community that I have given information to, and I'll want to take the information you present today back to those people to be able to then give more feedback.
Great. Okay, Rob.
Thank you. I just want to note that our discussion last time, some members of this committee had a little bit of discomfort or dis-ease with having this discussion, feeling like it went beyond the scope of what the charges committee is. And I think where we ended up was that we're just citizens giving staff advice. And if some people want to participate, that's great. If others don't, that's fine too. I just want to note that I note some people in the meeting from last time are not here today. Thank you.
So I think I'm going to just jump in and respond here real quick. I do have to apologize because I thought that we would get an email out to the group to respond to that comment, but we went back and looked at the resolution and the bond that was passed by voters. And the SRP is technically a department advisory committee. So it's not it's not a commission that reports to the city council. It's a department advisory committee. And it actually technically reports to the city manager under the terms of the bond measure and the resolution that council passed, although the city manager has delegated that to the public works director. And so that when we kind of go through, for example, adding new members to the SRRP, that ends up being a public works director approval process that we've been going through as an example. So from that standpoint, I think that we're totally good with coming to the SRP and even getting a recommendation from the SRP, because I think that's in line with the role of a department advisory committee.
And Jennifer, just a quick follow-up. We did send that information out to the group not long after we had our last discussion. So I just want to highlight for the group in terms of process today, super excited that we have lots of faces in the room. We're going to go through the presentation. Certainly want to hear from the SRP member group. And then we'll also hold a time after that discussion if there's comments and questions also from other interested parties as well, because we're glad you're here and your input's valuable. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to roll through this. Usually Rob Interfeld and I tag team this. My intention today when we talk through this is to provide information, a little bit of its background. We'll go through some process, but certainly I'm not going to read the slides to you, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions. And so just as a brief outline, we're going to talk about bond history, just at like, the 5,000, 10,000 foot level is a reminder of how we got here. We're going to talk a little bit about our thoughts around the framework and kind of the approach to the potential 2022 bond measure. We're going to talk a little bit about timeline. I want to give this group an overview of where we've been in terms of stakeholder engagement to date and what else we have planned. Then we'll talk a little bit about some potential bond scenarios, and then we'll go through a couple of example projects and have feedback and questions. And this is really interesting because some of this group have seen this presentation now several times, so that's fun. So bond history, going back all the way to the beginning. I know that some of this SRP group has been involved since the very beginning and before, but going back, our first bond, 2008, $39 million with a small amount dedicated for the off-street path system. Fast forwarding 5 years, 2012, went for $43 million with more money, $500,000 for annually for active transportation, not necessarily just the off-street path system anymore. And then fast forward 5 more years to the current bond measure, which is the 2017 bond measure. There's about $51 million and has about $1 million annually for active transportation. So just as a reminder, this current bond that we're in started in 2017. Collecting the proceeds from the bond will expire. That will end in 2023. And we anticipate that the projects themselves from that bond list will be completed in 2024. So on this slide, I want to talk about the approach, a little bit of where we have been, and then a little bit of how we're looking at this potential new street bond. So you'll notice in 2 columns, some of the things are same, some are different. So we're talking about tax rate. What we're looking at both in previous approach and the future approaches, we're looking at keeping that tax rate consistent. And once we get into feedback and questions, we can have a discussion on what that looks like in terms of how we communicate that. We've gotten some feedback in terms of, the level of complexity in which we talk about that. And I view this group as a technical group so that we can get into some of those details, but we do recognize that as we continue to share this information and continue to refine this moving forward, that really that information needs to be shifted so that we're being smart in our communications and communicating that in a smart way, in a strategic way. So Rob, we had a great discussion about that during the BEST discussion. So I appreciate that feedback and we'll be mindful of that. So in the previous approach, that second bullet, really we focused on pavement preservation, right? We had pavement preservation. We know that we've been battling the backlog for a long time. And so really we had that focus on pavement preservation, which did include some things like curb ramps and some small other upgrades as funding has been available, but mostly really on pavement preservation and then using local and grant funds elsewhere to help supplement when we can. The biggest piece of this updated approach is that we're proposing that the new projects will be more of a complete streets model, so that it will include pavement preservation at the core, but then we're also including some of those other pieces. So it'll still be curb ramps, but even things like stormwater facilities, potentially street trees, as we go along, that we're doing more of a complete street within the budget of the project. So it's not separate, it's just in the project will be a complete street project itself moving forward. And then the next item, talking about additional funds for walking and biking. As we previously have talked about, each of the bonds has had a set aside amount dedicated to that. And we would still we're proposing in this future bond, we would still have dedicated funds for walking and biking, but then also expanding that a little bit to say, you know, safety and neighborhood livability. Then the last bullet on that updated proposed approach was just saying that, yes, we still would anticipate the practice of using other local and grant funds to supplement project budgets as necessary. So I want to talk a little bit about timeline, really high level. So the last several months, you know, before the end of the year, in the last several months, what we've started doing is really looking at the framework, kind of the bounds of the bond. What are our goals? What are we looking to do? And what does that framework look like? So now we're into March, which is kind of wild that it's March already. But kind of in these parallel tracks of engaging stakeholder groups in February, March, while also looking back to our transportation policy group is a check-in to say, okay, are we on the right track? You know, what's the feedback we've been getting? Do we need to make adjustments as we move forward? So the next step is starting to have those more formal conversations with City Council. And we anticipate that those will be in that April, May timeframe. And I did add a red arrow in there to indicate that we are planning on working with a polling company to do some polling. And I know that contract is already underway. Rob, do you want to ask your question before I go on?
Yeah, just is April, May, July intentional, skipping June, or is that a typo?
It just meant for the next several months we'll be having conversations.
Okay.
We also recognize that the conversations with council will probably be at least 3 meetings throughout the spring and summer. And if council chooses to move this forward, and that's kind of this big if, you know, when we're talking about this potential street bond measure, is that really it's council's choice whether they want to move this forward and what it looks like. So if council moves it forward, we would anticipate that the result of that would be a resolution for the language that would be on the bond measure for a public vote in November. Yeah, Ellen, did you want to ask a question real quick?
Are you going to be talking more about the polling at a later point?
We can, if you would like to. I think, how about we save it to the end and then we can talk.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
it's
that sounds good.
that communications piece. Jennifer, did you have something you wanted to correct, add, supplement?
Not correct, but just kind of supplement I think the April, May, July are kind of reflecting some placeholders that we have on the tentative calendar with council that I believe that we have a tentative placeholder for April to bring the SRRP annual report to council. Yes. And talk about pavement management system report. May would be then our first meeting with council to kind of talk about the information that we gathered through all of this feedback and more data as we gather it, and also probably get some feedback from that April meeting from council that then we can come back to them with a proposed bond framework. And then July, it'd either be late June or in July that then council would pass the resolution if they were to pass a resolution.
Thank you for adding that. So next I'd like to talk a little bit about the stakeholder groups and the outreach that we've done to date and where we're planning. So as I mentioned earlier, we have had a similar conversation with the Active Transportation Committee. Rob and I met with that group or attended that meeting in February, and we are planning on going back to that group. I guess it's already next week in March. And then earlier this week, my days all run together. I think it was earlier this week, we met with community stakeholders hosted by Rob at Best. Having this meeting, Rob and I have a meeting scheduled to talk at the LGAC meeting next week as well with that group. And then we're working on this schedule to talk with the Sustainability Commission as well. Oops. And in terms of internal stakeholder groups, we've been doing a lot of communication back and forth with our transportation management team and our transportation policy team, and have given this information to our climate action team as well. So I want to next go into talking a little bit about potential bond scenarios. And we have, as we've been working through these scenarios and then talking about what the framework of the bond might look like. You know, we look at these adjustments and what the potential bond measures will look like. So I'm going to describe them on your screen to be from left to right. So on left, really represents something that's really consistent with what our current bond measure is, where we have primarily pavement preservation, and then we have a slice for active transportation, that orange slice. And then moving over, one is talking about the thinking for the potential bond measure where we have pavement preservation, but it's more complete streets, right? So those are wrapped together. And then we still have a slice for active transportation. And then as we move right, the same idea, but having a little larger slice for, we're calling it, you know, dedicated funds for walking, biking, safety, and neighborhood livability. So in each one of these scenarios, that little slice, that orange slice gets a little larger. And a piece of clarification for the people who attended the presentation earlier in the week, we tried to make it more clear that the slice that we were representing for complete streets is part of the pavement preservation. So that's why you see the second blue slice that's still small, but still the same color. So in each of these scenarios, we have pavement preservation and complete streets, and then a slice for active transportation and funds for safety and neighborhood livability. Okay, I am going to go through a couple of.
I have a question on that last slide.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So in the second slide, it looks like, sorry, in the second pie chart, that additional 10% in that blue slice, that would be for safety and neighborhood livability. Is that right?
No, the orange slice is things for active transportation and walking, biking, safety, and neighborhood livability.
Okay, so the safety and neighborhood livability funds are coming out of the orange. The second small blue pie piece is the complete streets.
Yes. Yes, it is, because we're wrapping it into pavement preservation, right? It's part of doing the street, whereas the orange slices can supplement those projects, but also could be standalone projects as well, you know, as identified in the TSP through working with the Active Transportation Committee, et cetera.
Okay.
So I was going to say one thing to kind of make clear here a little bit is that when we talk about the pavement preservation and complete streets, we're thinking of the same model as the previous bond measures where those are named street projects. And traditionally the orange slice is more flexible funding in that we're not naming the projects ahead of time in the bond measure itself, but that we're saying that we're going to spend that orange slice money on projects as identified by the TSP, ATC, staff. I mean, that there's like a framework of how those projects are going to be identified that will focus on that. Whereas with the blue group, those are typically named projects in the bond measure that's what we have to spend the money on.
Is there a reason that you would specific bike ped projects as well? Just because it's harder, or they're smaller projects, or is there a reasoning behind not having specific projects for the out of the bike ped TSP project list included in the bond?
I don't think that there is a specific reason of why that hasn't been. I think that typically the flexibility has been appreciated in that orange. I mean, I'll just say in the orange slice, because sometimes it allows a little bit more of able to react to situations, so that if there is an observation of just something operationally not working well, or there's a change in traffic patterns or operations or things like that, then by not having a whole list of listed projects that use up that money, we can kind of adapt a little bit to what are the current situations. And or if there's sometimes that money has been used as local match for grants. So we sometimes can't predict what the grants are going to be 5 years in advance, but we get fortunate enough that we get a really great grant to do a Safe Routes to School project or something like that, we would sometimes use that money from that flexible pie slice to provide local match for that grant.
Thank you.
Yes, John. You're muted, John.
So this new concept of complete streets, that's a total deviation from the previous 3 bond measures where the primary purpose of the bond was to preserve our existing street network. Is that correct?
I would say no. I'd say it's not correct. I'd say that it does have pavement preservation in it. We're just being more inclusive. So we're including more in the projects, but still focusing on maintaining our existing infrastructure. So I should say it's partially correct. It's not a complete deviation. It's a slight deviation to be more inclusive.
So we're planning to divert funds from street repairs to this new, more expanded concept of complete streets. Is that right?
Yes, we would be using some of the funds for the complete streets improvements.
Can you describe what those would include?
Sure. Yeah, some examples of that would be, we already do curb ramps. So we could include stormwater facilities if we needed, median islands, street trees, things, if there was alley aprons as we went through. So some of those things that historically, sometimes we've been able to add, and a lot of times we haven't because of the funding, but we understand that there's benefits to that, especially with our CAP 2.0 and our sustainability efforts, that it makes a lot of sense. And really those are city priorities and goals also, to make sure we're incorporating those things into our projects moving forward. And so I would propose, yes, there's a lot of great questions and I want to hear every one of them. I would also like to move forward with the presentation though, so that I could give a couple of examples of the projects. And then we can get into more details, because some of the example projects that I want to give a highlight on include some of those aspects. And I think that will help show what some of those complete street pieces are. So Jim, for example, I see your hand and I really want to hear what you have to say. I'd like to go through and do the example projects, and then we can come back to questions.
I lowered my hand so I give you a chance to talk.
Okay, so first example project here, and again, these are just a snapshot, and where I should have mentioned this before, where we are in our project list right now is really, we're kind of at that 150% list, which we have a list that we're working on prioritizing that's much bigger than the available funds. And so we're going to whittle that down as we keep moving forward. First example project here is River Road. And this specific section is from Green Lane to Corliss. And when we're talking about improvements, complete street improvements, certainly we would rehabilitate the existing service. But then in the TSP for this section, it does call out for protected bike lanes. So that's something we would investigate. We also recognize that this section is part of the bigger moving ahead process. So we recognize that as a thing that we have to coordinate, making sure that our left hand is talking with our right. And my working with Rob Interfeld is actually really great, because he's the city manager for that process. So we have a lot of back and forth and coordination there.
Excuse me, Katie, could you tell me where are Green Lane and Corliss? I don't know those streets.
It's pretty far north. So it's south of the Beltline, but the Beltline in this picture is just out of the reach. So we're not very far south of the Beltline.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So the next example project is North Terry Street. So this is north, kind of near the connection to the new Justin Path. So when we're looking at the potential improvements on this section, we would rehabilitate the existing roadway. The TSP calls for sidewalk infill in here because this is a section that is missing sidewalk. And then some things to highlight here is there is a potential to reduce the amount of impervious surface, to have a positive effects on the heat island effect and with our CAP 2.0 goals. So potentially reducing the amount of pavement, because in this section, the street is really wide. has a wide center turn lane, but there's no side street adjustments to it. So it has a lot of potential to look at other options for that space. The next potential project is Cityview Street, so south of 13th. We would rehabilitate the existing roadway. The TSP calls for bike lanes in this section. We also potential for traffic calming and improvement of the Fern Ridge Path connection and crossing. Then the next example is Amazon Parkway. So 24th to 27th. Really what that one looks like is we rehabilitate the existing roadway. Look at some pedestrian crossing improvements. Rob, when we get to this slide, Rob always says that we've received a number of requests over the years to have a pedestrian crossing up by that large sequoia at 27th. So potential pedestrian crossing improvements and then sidewalk access ramp upgrades. So I will leave it here for a minute and say thanks for going through the presentation. Then I'm going to unshare so that I can see more people on the screen because I can only see 2 or 3 people, and then we can talk about the questions that you have.
Katie, you also have a couple comments in the chat too.
Okay, that's great. Rachel, can you read us the comments in the chat and then we'll do hands?
Sure. So the first comment is from Lynn. She says, please add sidewalk repairs due to wrong trees planted in the past. So I would probably put that under sidewalk repairs.
And the sidewalk issue we acknowledge is really complicated. So we're having ongoing discussions about it because currently the sidewalks are the responsibility of the property owner, yet street trees are the responsibility of maintenance. And we know that there's sidewalk infill needs. And so that's part of a kind of a bigger picture discussion that we don't want to blow over and say, oh, it's simple, or oh, we're not going to do it. It's complicated, and we're trying to work through that to see what's possible and how we can move through that. And I know maintenance currently has a great program where they're working through some of those sidewalk repair challenges as well.
And the second comment is from Rob. You also have your hand up, so I don't know if you want to explain your comment or if you had a different one.
Well, I just noticed a typo in there. Let me just read what I meant to chat. Messaging suggestion. Frame the blue slices of the pie as, quote, dedicated, and the orange slices as flexible, without necessarily putting on other labels that will attract some voters and repel others. Just sort of using value and neutral language and describing, we want to tell voters that the money's going to be, a lot of the money's going to be used for these things, and tell them what isn't dedicated. But I'm hearing sort of reserve some for flexible uses and sort of leave it at that. Thanks, Rob. And I think this gets to our discussion of where we shift from a technical discussion to communicating with the larger public. Is that as we move forward, I do not intend that we'll have a lot of pie charts in it, just mostly used as a visual for these groups to say, okay, this is how we're kind of measuring these out. Don't anticipate that those will be in our messaging moving forward, but I appreciate your input there. Rachel, was there any more comments?
Yeah, we just had a comment from Alan, which is just saying that complete streets has been a city and state policy for many years, and that's the last one.
Okay. Hey, Jim, you had a question?
Okay. Yeah, I think it's kind of going back to what John Quilter is getting at, is the definition of the scope of the bond has been curb to curb. And so what you're proposing is to deviate from that. And I think that those deviations are well worthwhile and meet a lot of other bigger picture goals. But so what you want this flexibility. So what is the definition? Is it as simple as curb to curb, or is it just open game, or what is the definition of that you can have? I think that's one of the things that's been clear to the public, is that okay, it's pavement preservation, curb to curb, and okay, as a community we can agree to expand that idea, but how do you define it? That's my question.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Jennifer, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, I think in some ways the resolution of in the bond language in the current bond is not quite as clean as just curb to curb. It does talk about pavement preservation and preservation, and I'm gonna not be an exact quote, but it says, and preservation of integral infrastructure to the street. And so theoretically, we could be beyond just the curbs, because I could argue that sidewalks are integral to the street. I could argue that stormwater is integral to the street, but typically when we've gone through and budgeted for the bond, we haven't included those things. And we actually get a fair amount of comments from the public that when we come through and repave a street, they say, why didn't you fix that thing there? Or we've really needed a street light here where somebody almost got hit, or, and all those things that were never really contemplated in the budget for the project. And I think we're just trying to find a way of how do we include some of those things that haven't been included in the past. And part of it is we're in really technical, detailed language here with a group like you. For in the bond measure language itself, it might not be that specific and detailed when we talk about it. It's just trying to figure out what do we actually include in our estimates and the types of projects that we include to put together a bond.
I think the example that comes to mind for me the most is stormwater funds, and there's a stormwater fee that everybody pays, and so it seems that the pavement preservation bond is had supplemental funding from other sources, and it looks like on this that maybe this bond would be the lead funding source for some of these things versus the thing that's supplemented from other things. So that's what it looks like to me anyway.
Thanks for your input, Jim. So we're going to go Ollie and then Sue.
Yeah, to what extent is
I still want to be in the queue.
Am I on? Yeah.
Yep.
The expansion to the complete streets, some of that, like the street trees and to a certain extent, stormwater would be eligible for road fund money. What percentage or to what extent is some of the complete street strategies not eligible for road fund or not eligible for other sources of money that might be out there? I mean, is this bond fund the only way that some of these things would get done?
I think that's a great question, Ollie. Some of that I'll let Jennifer to speak to, or say, hey, we can follow up on it. And some of that is the challenge of the strain on all of the resources. For example, we have worked to try to incorporate some of those things when funds are available. Just sometimes funds are not available, right? There is no money in this, for example, no money in stormwater utility fee to include a piece, an aspect. And so this is a way of saying, hey, let's make sure we're doing a complete street repair, knowing that we can still supplement and those other funds are still available for capital funds. Jennifer, do you want to speak to the road fund piece?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a great answer with the road fund piece. As you on the SRP probably are pretty aware, we've talked about this a few times. The city's budget dedicates most of the road fund that we receive to operations and maintenance. There is a small amount of road fund that goes towards some traffic calming, and there's some other kind of like signal work and some things like that it goes to. But for those of you who aren't necessarily aware, so when we talk about road fund, that is money that it comes from gas taxes, and primarily it comes through the state, but that can include gas taxes from our state. When you pay at the pump, there's taxes included in each gallon of gas that you buy, and this is our share of that money. There is ORS that says that that can only be spent within the street right away. And so there are things that don't qualify for that. But the way that the city's budgeting has been set up for quite a long time now is that most of that money just goes towards operations and maintenance. And so when operations and maintenance gets too costly for a particular street, hopefully this kind of capital, right now we're funding it through the bond measure, that this capital fund will do a rehab project on that street to decrease the maintenance need on that street and have it last longer. But yeah, I mean, just because of the choices that city and city council has made through budgeting process, we have very limited road funds that are available for this kind of work.
Okay, so next up would be Sue and then Rob and then John Quilter. You're on mute, Sue.
Okay. Yeah, I've actually got a lot of questions, but some of them are sort of related, and it's kind of what Jim and Ollie have already asked, and it's kind of concerns getting the most bang for our bond measure money. So like on some of these, if we're doing multimodal corridor improvements, I would think, especially something like River Road, I would think that would have a good fighting chance of getting funded by a grant. So are we giving up on grants because we've got this bond measure money that the bond measure could also be used for other things? And secondly, we have done stormwater and street trees in the past. How are those, why are we not continuing to fund those the way we have in the past, instead lumping them into the bond measure? And I guess also, do we end up with some of these complete streets improvements working on streets that otherwise would not need any treatment yet? So again, all of these just kind of related to how do we get the most money, the most bang for the buck out of the bond measure?
Sure. So just a minute, I'm writing a note about your okay. So I heard three things there, and I'll try to touch on each of them. And if I didn't capture it, just let me know, Sue. So first was talking about grants. Absolutely, we will still continue to look after grants. The bond measure funds can be used as match if we needed to, as the local share if we needed to, and absolutely for these larger projects, like 8th Avenue is an example, one that we've talked about with this group for the last couple of years. That's a great example, and River Road might be another example of that. So yes, we would continue to look for grants. This would not change our practice moving forward of how and where we apply for grants. Second, when you ask about some stormwater and some trees, and part of it is that trying to make the improvement towards making progress on our goals. We've had a lot of discussions recently about trees and how many trees can we put on a street, and identify, just in practice, identify the potential number of places we can plant street trees. And then a person will come to Rachel, for example, and say, okay, I have the potential for 94 trees. And we say, well, we can fund 2 trees. Right. And so it's like, that's the funding we have, right? We're doing the best with the funding we have, but there's not funding available right now to make a significant difference. We've been using little pieces of money here and there I think we have a strong track record of utilizing our funds and leveraging funds from different places to do good projects. It's just that the funds right now for the projects do not include enough to have a substantial impact in terms of reducing our heat island effect, planting street trees. So we're trying, the effort here would be to just include that so that we can say, oh, okay, if there's 30 places to plant a tree on this street, well, maybe now we can plant 30 trees, or maybe we can plant 15 trees, but it's not a discussion of, sorry, I can't fund any trees in that example. And then your third question about non-streets that otherwise would not get treatment. And I'd say it depends. The way that we've been prioritizing the list is starting with pavement preservation, looking at the list of the streets that we from the pavement management system, the list of the streets that need rehabilitation in somewhere in the next 5 to 8 years. Evaluating those is like the base, right? We know that that's the list, that's the need, right? And I think that when we're talking about funds like active transportation funds or funds for neighborhood livability or safety, those are some funds that could be flexible, that could be used for projects that are maybe not on the specific bond listed streets. So those would be some of those, the more discretionary funds that as we're going through, if there's an opportunity, for example, for a neighborhood greenway that's adjacent to a bond funded streets, those funds could potentially be used for that work. But the streets themselves, the pavement preservation streets, so the bulk of the listed projects would all be developed from that listed need from the pavement management system.
Can I just jump in a little bit
Absolutely.
too? One thing that came to mind as Katie was talking about, for example, street trees. Some of you are probably, I think this will tie some of the work that the SRP has been doing, but also if some of you are familiar with the capital improvement program, the CIP that gets adopted every other year. One of the things that's in there is that we've been, the last couple CIPs, we've included the embodied greenhouse gas emissions to the materials for construction. And those are the people that have been on the SRP know that we've done a lot of work to try to lower those embodied greenhouse gases in construction materials. But we're kind of at this place now that technology-wise, we don't really have an obvious next step on how to reduce those embodied greenhouse gas emissions in construction materials. And so one thing that we're kind of looking at, are there some things that we can do in our projects that help kind of balance that out as far as the embodied greenhouse gas emissions? So for example, planting more trees on projects is kind of almost, I don't know if this is the right word, but almost like a cost of business kind of thing, that to help kind of balance that out, that we have to do construction and construction is going to have these greenhouse gas emissions to it. So is there something that we can do to help counteract that? And so just looking for opportunities to be able to do more of that kind of thing while also still being able to preserve this existing infrastructure, recognizing that by allowing it to deteriorate and have to be reconstructed would have even more greenhouse gas emissions embodied into that work as well. So just always looking for a way to keep dropping that number down further and further.
Thanks for adding that. So next up, we have Rob in the queue, then John, then Jim.
Thank you. I just want to sort of offer my view of how to frame the discussion we're having. I was a member of the original street repair task force that City Manager John Reese and Public Works Director Kirk Corey put together back in 2008 that resulted in the first bond measure. At the time, then Eugene Mayor Kitty Piercy was running for re-election against Jim Torrey, and potholes were a big issue. There was a big backlog. And to his credit, City Manager John Reese saw an opportunity to respond to what a lot of voters were saying and give them an opportunity to provide funding for that. And that was the genesis of these bond measures. But I want to point out that it was an opportunity to sort of match a need with what voters might support. We're not in a situation where that's the only need we have, or the only thing that voters care about, or we've got funding for everything else. Our challenge here, I think, is to match a greater funding need for transportation with what the voters care about and will support. Maybe that's curb to curb, maybe that's preservation, maybe it's not. I know people on this discussion have our own personal views, but we're not the voters. And if all of us agree or disagree with each other, but the voters have another opinion, they trump. And so I'd urge us not to sort of have arguments amongst ourselves about what's most important, but to try to sort of match what the needs of our city are for transportation with what the voters are willing to support. And I don't know exactly what that is, but I don't really want us to have debates in this committee about what's more important, less important, unless we happen to know that voters agree with us. Thank you.
Okay, John Quilter. Thank you, Rob.
Well, going back to that just previous comment, my concern sometimes is that The voters are not always the ones who receive a tax bill and actually have to pay the bills for the things that we decide we want to do. With 49% of the residents in Eugene renters, that's a very large percentage of people that get no tax bill. So when they see something that comes along in a bond measure that they think, oh, that's a great idea, yeah, I'll vote for that. But they never see the cost, and the landlords are generally not very transparent in passing on to their tenants why rents have increased due to increases in overall taxation over time. So those folks basically get a vote, but they don't pay, and so that tends to distort the situation a bit, in my opinion.
Thank you for your input, John. So Jim Mender, you're up next, and then Zach.
Thank you. When I try to look at this whole picture, and we've spent years talking about the backlog and how adding this additional scope to the bond and that sort of thing. How do we manage that backlog? Because I think that's one of the key components of the bond measure is it keeps that every day we drive on the street and we create more backlog. And so that continues to grow every year, and we continue to do work to reduce it. And so there's some kind of balance there in funding between the two, and has staff considered that balance and how to keep that in check, basically.
Yeah, and I think that it's important, Jim, and I think that's one of the reasons why we've been looking for feedback from a number of different groups, like looking at different perspectives, because we know it's a balance, right? Because there is a balance. And I also think it relates to our previous discussions, and when we're reporting on backlog, we've had some discussion on what does it mean in terms of dollar value, when really we look at the data, and really it's the local streets, right? The local streets are the pieces that are the hardest to talk about because they represent 70-ish% of that backlog. So how do we quantify that, and should we shift into talking about more of a condition index rather than a dollar index? So I think those are all considerations. I think it's important, but we recognize that there's got to be a balance there in terms of what are the needs, what will the community support, what will council support, and how does it meet the city goals? I don't think it's all the way one way or the other. And so we're trying to find that sweet spot using a lot of feedback from these groups about what's important. So Zach, you had your hand up and now your hand is down. Would you still like to ask a question?
I guess just two clarifications. One is when the bond, it sounds like when the bond actually goes to voters, it'll be very similar to last time, and it'll have a long list of projects. It's just that some of those projects will now also have like sidewalks and bike lanes and walks. And
Yes.
as
Yes.
10% of these larger projects rather than needing to be funded by outside sources and often not happening. That's correct?
Yes, it is. And I think in just a minute, Zach, I actually think, Sue, that relates to one of your comments in the chat box. Is originally when Rob and I talked to the ATC, we were talking about like in this multimodal. And that's one of those pieces where we've kind of evolved with feedback to saying, hey, I think it makes more sense to talk about this as a street bond, right? Because that we're very familiar with it. And so we're staying very consistent with what we're doing and moving forward. Yes, expanding on that, but we've had success with this and we want to continue to move that forward. So really just shifting the language to say, hey, we thought maybe we would use this language, but now we're evolving to say, okay, maybe that doesn't make sense. Let's stay to what we know is successful, and how can we still incorporate some of those other needs?
Okay, and then a second clarification.
Go for it.
The bond rate is proposed to stay the exact same, correct? We are not proposing to increase the bond rate. And I think renters are not so naive to think that they don't pay the taxes on the properties that they rent. I think they know what decisions that they're making when they vote to support a bond. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we are at this time saying, yes, we think we'll keep the rate the same. Certainly as we continue to evolve this and it goes to city council, all of this is up to them, right? They might say, I mean, they have a whole variety of things that they could say, but currently we're saying, yes, we would keep that rate consistent. So in the queue, I have Sue and then Ollie.
Yeah, since nobody had their hand up, I thought I'd just ask the question that I put in the chat, which is namely, I don't know if we're still using the term multimodal corridor, but it just seems like there's a lot of overlap between a multimodal corridor and a complete street and neighborhood livability, which is, and yet you have them kind of parceled out as if they're totally separate. So can you tell us what the difference is?
Could I jump in? I'm Rob Interfeld, Transportation Planning Manager. Sorry, I couldn't be here at the beginning of the meeting. I'll take a crack at it. So I think Complete Street was just an attempt to use more easily understood methodology. I'm sorry, terminology than multimodal. So just the idea that the streets that are being paved as part of the bond measure, to our best extent, we'd like to make sure that those streets are complete streets when we're done, that they have the basic elements of a street, like a sidewalk, like street trees, thinking about what makes a street complete. It's not just the travel lanes. The neighborhood livability, which would be part of the set aside, whether it's 10, 20, or 30%, that's sort of like our traffic calming program, but it could be, maybe more flexible than that. So the idea is that are there things that help make streets and neighborhoods more livable for the people who live there, in addition to like the pedestrian and bicycle projects that we've typically done with the bond measures. So it could be like traffic calming. There's a lot of demand for that all over the city, and we have very little funding currently to deliver the traffic calming for the folks that are asking for it. It could be street trees is another thing.
Street lights,
Right.
illumination. Okay, so I think we're Ollie and then John Quilter.
Yeah, I may have missed something. Are you saying you're going to be building sidewalks with the bond money rather than assessing the abutting property owner, which is, I thought, the typical practice?
So we have danced around the topic. Sidewalks, there's a need. And it's complicated because of the way the current requirements for assessing a property owner. But we are talking about it and trying to figure out what and if there's a path forward there, because it is a need and it is part of making sure that, we're making a transportation network that's connected, especially if we want to continue to work towards a mode shift. All of these pieces kind of fit together. That one just happens, the sidewalk piece just happens to be really complicated because it has this other requirement right now. So I don't have an easy answer, but we're not assuming that we're just going to blanket do this as part of the bond, but we're looking at what the options are and what that might look like moving forward.
Okay.
Also, if I could just add to that,
Yeah, absolutely.
From Katie's presentation, Ollie, like some of those examples, there weren't necessarily abutting property owners. So Terry Street, it's really the back of those subdivisions, and presumably all those houses also front onto a public street too, with a sidewalk. And then Amazon Parkway too, it may not be the highest priority to have a sidewalk on Amazon Parkway, but if we did build one there, we're the property owner, right? The city is. So there's some cases like that too, but I think there's a need to have a broader conversation in Eugene about sidewalk infill. And you may have noticed we haven't been building many sidewalks by property owners paying for them in recent history. And I think there's not necessarily the political appetite to do assessments, but maybe there could be some meeting halfway where the bond measure pays for part of the cost and then the property owner pays a lower amount that's more affordable. And then maybe we also have subsidies for lower income property owners. So just some thoughts on that.
Okay.
Thanks, Rob. So John Quilter, you're up. John, are you able to unmute and ask a
Okay,
question?
yeah, sorry.
problem.
So there was talk that we would keep the tax rate the same, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the overall revenue generated from a bond would remain the same as before, because just looking at my tax figures, I see that the tax value on my properties increased over 12% in the last 5 years. So wouldn't that mean that we would get additional revenue even if we kept the tax rate the same as before?
Yes, it would. And it's a glaring error that I'm not, as many times as we've given this presentation, I'm not sure how I missed it. I should have said it up front. Our current was about 51 million, and we're projecting with the same tax rate that we would be about $62 million. So there would be an increase. I'm sorry that I omitted and left that out earlier, John.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's a combination of increased assessed values. And so same thing, if assessed values go down, then the revenues go down too, but also just new and annexed properties coming into the city to add to that number. So we have our finance people kind of do a little bit of estimating of that happening too over the course of the bond.
So that might actually give us an opportunity to reduce the tax rate because we're getting additional properties that are paying into the fund. And we're also seeing a general increase in existing properties tax assessments.
So there are definitely two ways that we could approach this. One way is that we could say we're going to do 65 cents per $1,000, and whatever happens to properties in the course of those 5 years, then that total number will change with that. The other version is that we say we want $60 million, and based on current assessed value of properties, that's about 65 cents, but we're never going to get more or less than $60 million. And so that tax rate will fluctuate from year to year to make that total number always stay 60 million, if that makes sense. So there's kind of two paths we can choose to go here. And I think that that's going to be part of the conversation with council.
And so I don't see any hands up right now, but before we go forward with any more questions,
Lynn has her hand up.
Lynn, I do want to reach out to a couple of people who we haven't heard from the SRP. So Janine, I saw that you put a comment in the chat that, yes, there's some other sources floating around that we don't have really good direction on. But I did want to see if you have any comments, Janine, or anything that you wanted to ask or give input on.
Well, I appreciate hearing. Well, thank you for asking. And I'm really just taking this all in. And I appreciate the, clarification on the number fluctuating, even if the tax rate stays the same, and how big that is. And I was just thinking in my head, with inflationary costs, the number of projects we're able to do might stay the same even with that higher number, just because everything is so expensive to do right now. So in terms of the number of projects, we might not, even with an additional $11 million, you might not get that much more accomplished. So I was like playing around with that idea in my head. I appreciated what Rob said about this is really a balancing act about not what our priorities are, but what the value proposition is to the taxpayers. And I do have this sense that things have changed a lot. I mean, okay, who doesn't? Things have changed a lot in the past 5 years. And I just wonder where this is all gonna, play out in terms of all the needs and, homelessness and our parks and library and stormwater. And it just feels like a very complicated and complex, and I'm just glad that I don't have to make a decision about it. So my other comment would be, I think complete streets make a lot of sense. Some things are harder to fund or to fund well, and street trees are one of them. We have a lot of mortality, and we know that they are critical to livability and to cooling and to just making our community feel vibrant and like Eugene. So I feel like that's something that the general public is going to support. I would hope so. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. And I think the beauty of what you have been able to accomplish in the past 10 years or more is the leveraging of other additional outside funds and really being able to kind of make the puzzle pieces work to get the most value. And that's why I was asking about the federal funding. You know, we just keep hearing there's so much money coming down the pipeline, but I don't feel like anyone has a real clear picture of what that looks like and how we could leverage those dollars to kind of create, you know, help fill in those gaps or figure out how to rejigger what we're asking for so it makes the most sense. And maybe the timeline won't work for that, but I was just curious if you had better insights into what the federal funding streams might look like and how that could help us. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
I think that we probably have the same crystal ball that you do. That's like, it says that it's coming, but we're not really sure what it looks like.
Yeah, on the water side, you know, it isn't very attractive for us. You know, it's mostly low interest loans. And when you're able to bond, low interest loans really don't help you very much. So I'm hoping things are better on the transportation side than they are on the water infrastructure side, because it's been a little disappointing for us. We were really excited. Now, not so much.
Gotcha. So in terms of Q, I do want to hear from Brian McMurray and Matt Roberts and then Lynn. So Brian, did you have any comments or questions for us? I know you called in on your phone. And no is a perfectly acceptable answer. I just want to make sure that we're making space so that everybody can give input. So Matt Roberts, you're next on the hot seat. Do you have any comments, questions, input?
And I'm like kind of like Janine. I'm in agreement with her on her statements. And as we were talking about the tax rate and the increased property values, again, I think we need to get as much in this fund as possible for inflationary protection. It's almost like inflation guard by having property values go up, and we ask for the same amount. It gives us more money to take care of the costs of these improvements. So I think I've enjoyed the conversation today. A lot of new voices, actually.
Yeah, this is great. Okay, I did get a text from Brian and he said he appreciates the conversation, but no input at this point. So he is out there in the e-world. So Lynn, thanks for being patient. You're up next.
Not a problem. I'm just kind of the voice of Bethel. And we are getting a lot of trees right now, and we really appreciate it. But we're getting a lot of pushback on the street trees because of the sidewalk issue. And they're worried that their sidewalks are going to be ruined and they're going to have to pay for them. And I know I put a note in there, and I know you've already talked about the fact that it is, you know, kind of in the works. But I really think it's important, and I think there's going to be a lot of people appreciating it, not to have to pay for the sidewalks that are destroyed because of the wrong trees planted. And also in terms of putting in new sidewalks, we have quite a few in our area that they don't have sidewalks simply because they can't afford to have sidewalks put in at their expense, even if it isn't charged to them until after they sell. But that doesn't make any difference to them. They're very, very scared about that. So I think that needs to be considered with equity, and that, you know, the same thing with the street trees. And I do believe, I know that Friends of Trees are putting in the right trees now, but the wrong trees were put in many years ago, and there's a lot of damage. And for the homeowner to have to pay, you know, $1,000, $2,000 to fix their sidewalk, it just isn't right. So that's my 2 bits worth. Thank you very much.
I just want to let you know,
Sure.
the city does have a low-income subsidy program now for low-income property owners. I don't know the details of it. I also want to acknowledge there could be people that may not qualify. They may make too much money to qualify, but still, you know, it's still a struggle for them to pay for it. So I want to acknowledge that. But if it would ever be helpful to get you that information, Lynn, we could do that.
Yeah, please email it to me, and I can publish it on our newsletter.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, I appreciate the discussion from everybody. In just a minute, Alan, I'll make sure that we get to you. I do want to get a feel from the group about another meeting. Is there interest in the group? And you can just give me a thumbs up or a wave or whatever in the screen if you would like to have another follow-up meeting, kind of as we continue to evolve this. What's the feeling? I see one thumbs up, a couple of hands. Okay, then we will plan. I'll probably send out another doodle. I know that people's calendars are very full. We appreciate the time you spend. So I'll
Katie,
send.
my hand was not necessarily yes or no, but a question about sort of the timing. I mean, I'd like to have another meeting, but I guess I'd like to have another meeting when staff have sort of a more developed proposal for us to review.
Okay, yeah, I think that's really valid input. Thank you. So Alan, you're next, and then Jim.
Can I just, so the meeting, there's a hold on my calendar for next week. That's off, right?
Yeah, my intention was to cancel it, but I'll be honest and say that I was afraid if I canceled it like yesterday.
Yes, yeah.
Cause confusion. And so I thought, oh, we'll talk about it in the meeting this week, because originally I scheduled both meetings at the same time, but I do think it's appropriate to have a little wait. So after this meeting, I will cancel that. So there wasn't confusion about whether you show up today or not.
That's awesome.
I
couldn't make that meeting, so that's perfect.
Okay. Yes, Alan.
Yeah, I wanted to come back around to polling and
Mhm.
find out if there is any clarity about the kinds of questions that will be asked, and if there's an opportunity for this group to be able to make any recommendations about how those questions are structured, including the rate, the tax rate.
Jennifer, I'm hoping that you can speak to that a little bit. I know that you and Rob have better background than I do on that.
I think that if you have some thoughts on polling, it would be good to get that to us. I think staff are meeting with our polling consultant in a couple weeks to just kind of to just have our initial kickoff meeting with them. And obviously, I mean, they're professionals, and that's why we hired them, is because I don't know the right questions to ask to people. And I'm sure that we'll start getting a sense of the types of questions and what they're going to do for polling. But if you have some thoughts on things that you think would be interesting, we can certainly propose them. But I also think that I'm not saying that we won't use them. It's just that I am going to kind of lean heavily on what the professional tells us of what would be useful information, or how they can have those conversations with voters.
Okay, thanks. Is it the same outfit that provided polling data last time?
No, it's not.
Okay. So okay, it's a different group.
It's DH.
Davis, Hickton, and Migdal or something like that.
DHM.
Adam Davis, his term. DHM.
Okay.
Hey,
I
Jim,
always want to say DHS, and I know that that's a federal agency and not a polling group. And
your turn, Jim.
Okay. Well, I just thank the staff for giving us the idea of your thoughts and the different options that you have. I like the idea that you're considering street trees and all that as part of the bond measure, because when the bonds started way back when, that wasn't a community value. And so I think that it's nice to see the street repair bond start to reflect what the community's needs are beyond just the backlog of pavement, and just being able, the idea of overcoming some of the carbon sequestration and all that with the pay-as-you-go. I just like that kind of thinking, and I appreciate the thoughts that things are going in that direction. So thank you.
Thanks, Jim. So we have Rob and then John Quilter.
Two things. I just posted the link to the polling firm in the chat box. It's Davis, Hibbets, and Migdal. And I've worked with Adam Davis, and I know that he's worked with Tom Bowerman to do the Oregon Values and Beliefs Survey, and has done really good work. Some of that related to what people value around transportation broadly, if not specifically on preservation projects. what I intended to say is, and I don't mean to be cynical, but the city's gonna be asking taxpayers to fork up money. In a sense, they're customers, and in a sense that the city is a seller of something. And I would urge working with the polling firm more like a marketer or selling something. Think of sort of like a car company where you're trying to figure out what do people want in cars. You don't say, is it 8-point or 6-point cycle, this or that with certain numbers. You say, you know, what's valuable to it? It's like sexy or it's sleek or whatever. And really get at sort of what's important to people in terms of values, and then use that information to craft a bond measure that gives them what they're asking for and language around that that reflects what it is that they want, what's important to them. Rather than sort of taking these pie charts and then asking which of these 3 pie charts do you want? That's too technical.
Oh,
That would be my
absolutely.
advice.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Although I'm not sure I could, that we could swing, anybody could swing a sexy or a sleek out of pavement preservation, but I really appreciate what you're saying about communication there. That's really important. So John Quilter, you're up next. And then Jim, if you still have a question, or if you just have a lingering hand.
Yeah, my question is, well, we got another presentation by the polling organization. I found the one we had 5 years ago was quite informative, and I thought there was quite a bit of value in that presentation. My second question is, has it ever been considered that we would have a separate bond issue for other than street repairs, for things like street trees, sidewalks, complete street amenities and so forth, so that we give the people a chance to vote specifically on those things and separately on just the bare street repairs that the original bond measures were set up to do?
Jennifer, I'm going to let you answer that from kind of the policy
Yeah,
perspective.
I would say that the policy team has talked about that, and I while I can't necessarily point to a specific council meeting, but I feel like the council has even talked about some of those things as well. But yeah, I don't have a good answer for, you know, what the consideration is for this current bond measure, although I suppose that's something that council could decide in our presentation to them if they didn't want certain things to be included in this one to, you know, mix up the issues.
And to your other question, John, about the presentation after the polling, we can certainly talk about that as staff. I think it's a really good idea. So we can talk about what the schedule is and how that aligns with coming back to this group. I think that's the next step before we can really commit to say, yes, for sure. We'll look at those schedules and then we can come back. Okay, Sue, you're up.
Yeah, I was just, I'm still kind of wrestling with what exactly we mean by a complete street. In other words, if you're on a busy street, I presume you would need a protected bikeway. If you're on a residential street, maybe you don't need any define, you know, is it clear what a complete street might consist of in various settings?
Well, I think it's in the context of individual streets, right? Different streets will need different things. But I do think we, in our prioritization, are looking at things like the TSB and saying, what's already identified here? What's already been identified as the need for this street, right? And so there we have a guide that says, yes, this needs to be part of the project. And then some of those other things we've already talked about, you know, potential safety upgrades, you know, whether it's like street lighting, if there's upgrades to the traffic signal, if it's a larger street, bike facilities, like you talked about, some of the green infrastructure that we've discussed. So I do think it's really context sensitive in that way, and that it would be per street, because obviously a local connector is much different than a river road. So one size fits all in terms of what's included just isn't appropriate across the board, but would need to be determined individually. And so we've been working on that scoping kind of at that 150% list. And it's complicated, right? As we try to make sure that we know what's appropriate for each street. But that I do think that it needs to be individual.
There's also could be a community engagement component to that, getting an understanding of what are some of the issues on that street currently. One example is just where are there places where people don't feel safe crossing the street?
The other thing, I mean, because part of your question, Sue, to me felt like you were asking like the bigger question of what does complete streets even mean, let alone what are we talking about in this bond? And I think in the TSP, there is some definition of complete streets because there was also direction in the TSP to amend our current street design standards to incorporate complete streets principles. And so it did talk about the kinds of things that wanted to include in an update to our street design standards. So the TSP is probably a helpful place to go to. It does include things like more street trees, street lighting for safety, crossings and curb ramps, and all of those things that makes a street that is safe and usable for all users.
Okay, well, we've made it through and I don't see any more hands up. So from this discussion, we have a couple of things taking away. We'll get polling information. Alan, if you or others want to give input on potential, polling questions or polling ideas, send those to us. I will send out an informal poll on when our next meeting will be based on those other schedules, and we'll continue to refine this moving forward. Zach, I see you snuck in a hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering if anyone could speak to the cost issue.
What? I'm sorry?
Cost inflation. Do we know how much our costs of building construction projects up over the since 2017 when the original bond list was made and the original projections for how much that was going to cost were made? Is there any numbers on that?
So I can speak to it from a general sense, and then Jennifer, if you want to add in. So when we looked at the previous bond, the 2017 bond, we did put in or calculate, factor in an inflation factor. I think we're in like that 4 to 6% range is what we put in over the life of the bond. Now, the last several years, because we've been in a kind of unprecedented times, we have seen a dramatically higher increase in terms of the cost of construction. But I'm not an economist, so we don't really have an idea of where that's going, but we did factor it into the previous bond. But right now we're seeing costs that are significantly higher than that in the last couple of years. Does that help answer your question, Zach?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, well, I'm gonna wrap us up then. We'll have a few extra minutes in your afternoon. I really appreciate your time and your input. And thank you. We'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, everybody.